While every musical genre under the sun has a seemingly endless list of extremely talented musicians, and especially so these days, if you ask even the most casual of fans, they can still probably point out which ones are the most definitive, even if they aren't personally aware of how definitive they are or what exactly they define. And when an artist's presence is that important in their respective scene, they often will have a legacy that carries on for decades upon decades. But for as significant of achievements they might make during their best years, many of these artists will only be widely remembered for the contributions they make during those specific years. However, every genre has its few and far between whose prime years seem to go on for an exceptionally long time, and they continue to release top-shelf material for what might seem like an eternity to some. And because of this, generally speaking, these artists tend to be just as much gateway as they are game changer. And although punk certainly has more than a few of these, while they may not be at the top of everyone's list, there's one of these bands that may have one of, if not the most rabid cult fan base in the entire genre. And not only that, but one of the most interesting rises to fame in all of music history. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and my friends, welcome back to the second episode in our NOFX series here on the channel. As always, I'll be taking you all through the history of NOFX, starting with their beginnings in early 80s Los Angeles, all the way up to their current place in music today, of course along with some added trivia and some of my personal thoughts on one of the most influential bands of my entire life. Before we get started though, like I said, this is the second episode in my NOFX series, so if you haven't seen the first one, I'd recommend checking that out before you watch this one, and you can find a link to it in the description below if need be. Also, I thought I'd let you all know that I made a Spotify playlist of some of my favorite NOFX songs, along with the few and far between side projects the guys have had over the years, so if that sounds interesting to you, there will also be a link to that in the description as well. And lastly, I also, of course, have to give a huge shout out to my wonderful Patreon supporters. Thank you guys so much for your support. I've got some bonus content up on there, and any and all donations are hugely appreciated. And finally, if you are interested in seeing videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways! So picking up where we left off last time, following the release of The Decline, NOFX would keep themselves occupied with their typical schedule of touring and festival appearances, along with a few near wedding engagements and narrowly avoided fights sprinkled in just to keep things interesting. But amidst all this, the band, and Mike especially, would find a new way to make the good times feel even better upon discovering, or in Mike's case, rediscovering, the joys of taking pills. And for better or for worse, this type of copious drug use would quickly become a favorite activity on NOFX's tours for years to come. Not only that, but the pills became so popular amongst the band and their friends that they also made their way onto the title of NOFX's next LP, Pump the Valuum, which they began sessions for in 1999 at Motor Studios with Ryan Green. And the band would track, mix, and master 14 brand new songs with Ryan before the album officially released through Epitaph Records on June 13th of 2000. And this record picked up right where So Long and Thanks for All the Shoes left off, not only debuting a number of now fan favorite tracks, but also the one and only NOFX theme song, which features Eric Melvin playing the accordion, and would later go on to become their staple show closer. But that isn't this record's only gimmick, and another one is the song Dinosaurs Will Die's edition of a sample from a skit at the beginning of the FU's song Civil Defense. And that definitely isn't where the Easter eggs end with this record, and you can Google it if you want to know more. But more importantly, I think Pump the Valuum was a crucial indication that NOFX were not only well underway towards something bigger and better than most punk bands could ever hope to achieve, but were also in the perfect position to become one of the most noteworthy faces for an entire new generation of fans. Not only were they still going strong as ever into the new millennium, but they were still breaking into new territory and finding new ways to do so with every single release, and not just their full lengths. And as NOFX continued to get better and better at personalizing each of their releases with its own distinct identity, their fast, catchy, and snarky breed of punk rock continued to work like a charm. Keep in mind that by the time the 2000s rolled around, a lot of punk bands were very well defined in a specific niche. And while this certainly still could do great things for them in the punk underground, it wouldn't be enough to maintain the larger music world's attention. But Pump the Valuum is prime evidence that this was not going to happen to NOFX at all. And in fact, they were not only going to keep going places as music changed around them, but in the overall realm of alternative music scenes, they were going to become impossible to avoid. And while this might have pissed off off a handful of jaded, close-minded people, it was going to blow the minds of 50 more people for every one of them. And especially when you consider the more than impressive back catalog the band already had behind them by this point. And whether you were a punk rocker, a hesher, an emo, or even a goth, by the year 2000 you knew who NOFX was whether you liked it or not. Following the release of Pump the Valuum, NOFX would largely spend the next few years on the road, taking part in a couple of the yearly Warped tours as well as several different tours of their own throughout North America, Europe, Australia, and parts of Asia and South America. And alongside the hefty tour schedule, the band would also produce a handful of B-side releases and EPs, all of which they issued through Fat Records this time instead of Epitaph, as the label was now doing better than ever with its rapidly growing roster of cult favorite bands. The most noteworthy release from these few years, though, is of course their beloved split with Rancid from 2002, in which the two bands covered each other's songs, and NOFX's version of Radio has long since become a crowd favorite at shows. This split was actually the third entry in a series put on by BYO Records, and each volume featured cult favorite punk bands covering each other's music. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the Rancid and NOFX one is unquestionably the most famous. Part of this is simply just because these are two of the biggest punk bands in the world, but honest to God, the covers on both sides of this thing are pretty damn spectacular, and both bands still manage to sound entirely like themselves while performing each other's tunes. While we're on the topic of Rancid though, like I said last time, I've done an entire video on them, so if you're interested you can find a link to it in the description below. Following the split's release, NOFX and Rancid would then embark on a co-headliner throughout the US, and if I had a list of shows I'd like to go back in time to see, one of those dates would definitely be on there. But by 2003, NOFX were of course due for another full-length release, and after having developed a strong distaste for the newly elected US President George W. Bush, Mike had plenty of inspiration in the songwriting department. And once he'd cranked out some new material, the band headed back to Motor Studios with Ryan Green again in the winter of 2003, laying down another 14 tracks over the course of 4 months. But this time we can't give Ryan all the credit on the production side, because Fat Mike would also oversee things in the studio, making this release his first big-time production project. And once said project was finished, the album officially made its debut on May 6th of 2003 under the name The War on Errorism. And just like last time, NOFX hit the nail right on the head. The War on Errorism gave us another batch of new fan favorites, including the now cult classic She's Nubs, which led to a semi-successful career as a public figure for a NOFX fan named Tally Osborne, who the song was written about. And I have to say I kinda like that, because she's actually pretty badass and a great example of someone who managed to achieve great things despite being born with some pretty challenging disabilities. The band would also release an animated music video for the album's lead single, Franco Un-American, with which they would have all kinds of fun ragging on then President George W. Bush, and that might have even gotten this song a little more attention than originally anticipated, because it's now one of the most famous NOFX songs of all time. The War on Errorism would also be the band's first full-length release to issue through Fat Records, which made them now 100% independent. And although staying with Epitaph certainly wasn't gonna hurt them, the truth is NOFX just didn't really need their help anymore. And I gotta say, I think this might have built up some hype for Fat Records as well, because as I'm sure a lot of us probably know, they were the punk label by the end of the 2000s. But a new NOFX record wasn't the only iron Fat Mike had in the fire during the early 2000s. And during the presidential election of 2004, he was determined to do everything he could to stop Bush from getting a second term. So amidst his busy schedule with NOFX, Mike launched his now somewhat forgotten punk voter campaign. And I do say somewhat forgotten with a grain of salt, because although it may not get talked about too much these days, it would of course prove to be unsuccessful, Punk Voter did actually raise quite a bit of money and awareness while it was still going on. This is of course where the cult classic Rock Against Bush comps came from, and it would also prompt NOFX to break their press silence for the first time in 7 years. I'm sure some of you guys might also remember that goofy magazine photo of the band posing naked with a bunch of slogans written on them that was taken for alternative press, but something you might not know is that it was actually a parody of the Dixie Chicks doing the same thing for Entertainment Weekly the year prior, after they received a harsh response from their fans after they criticized George W. Bush. But although Punk Voter would prove to be a bit of a flop, like I said earlier, 2004 was by no means bad to NOFX, and the band would not only perform as one of the main events on that year's Warped Tour, but were also invited to perform on TV for the Conan O'Brien Show. The band would also issue a greatest hits compilation of sorts they titled The Greatest Songs Ever written by us that November, and the comp included 26 fan-favorite tracks along with one previously unreleased B-side called Wore Out the Soles of My Party Boots. NOFX would then spend the next 2 years balancing their hefty tour schedule with a healthy dose of writing and recording, and come 2006 they would lay down 19 brand new tracks at Motor Studios along with a cover of the band Vagina Dentata's song Golden Boys. But it didn't just stop there, because this time the band decided to bring in some bigger production names and hooked up with the Blasting Room's Jason Livermore and the Descendants' Bill Stevenson to work alongside them at Motor Studios. And with a little insight from Fat Mike, just like last time, the lot of them put together 2 brand new releases that quickly became all the rage in the punk scene of the mid-2000s. The first of these was a 6-song EP titled Never Trust a Hippy that made its debut on March 14th of 2006, and the second a full-length album by the name of Wolves in Wolves Clothing, which came out roughly a month later on April 18th. NOFX would also shoot a video for the song Seeing Double at the Triple Rock, which actually appeared on both releases, and if you don't know, the title is a reference to a now closed punk bar in Minneapolis, Minnesota called the Triple Rock Social Club, which was owned by Dillinger 4's Eric Funk. Fun fact about me, I actually used to live in St. Paul, Minnesota while the Triple Rock was still open, and I have some very fond memories of that club. May it rest in peace, and seriously, fuck COVID. But anyways, Seeing Double at the Triple Rock was merely one of several songs from these releases that quickly took off amongst fans. And I have to say, I think Wolves in Wolves Clothing is another stellar NOFX album that doesn't get enough credit these days. The band maybe weren't reinventing the wheel this time, sure, but at this point, I don't think they really had to. They already had a fantastic thing going, and it was working for them just as well as it had 10 years ago. Besides, this record is nothing but a good time from front to back, and it also has a similar sense of variety to what So Long and Thanks for All the Shoes had, but of course with its own unique touch. And keep in mind that this album came out a whole decade after Shoes did, which meant that now 23 years into their career, NOFX were somehow still in their prime. And they weren't showing any signs of slowing down either. But for as glamorous as things may have looked from the outside, internally it was a much different story. And conflicts surrounding Mike's drug habits would start to rise as the band began touring in support of the new releases. Like I said earlier, Mike had developed some pretty dangerous routines around the time Pump the Valuum came out. But by now, it wasn't just limited to overexerting himself with the band and crew after shows, and his using was slowly starting to bleed over into his personal life as well. And factor in the huge responsibilities of working things out in his complicated marriage and caring for his young child, the band and crew soon realized that they didn't know which version of Mike they were gonna get out on the road. And sometimes he would still be his usual self, telling jokes with his bandmates on stage and holding things down in the musical department to the best of his abilities. But other times he very much wouldn't be, and he would lash out at crowds, get too high or drunk to play, or otherwise just make a complete mess of things. Tensions between Mike and the rest of the band and crew would start to boil over during a tour with the Loved Ones in 2006, and after a few very serious meetings, they all decided they needed to have another intervention, this time for Mike. But although things would gradually start to improve afterwards, when shit hits the fan like this, it inevitably takes some time for everything to pan out. And NOFX not only had to set some strict ground rules about partying on the road, but they even decided to travel in 2 separate buses during that year's Warped Tour. But luckily, everyone involved was still able to pull through another very difficult period of their history, and things would eventually return to semi-normal, or at least as normal as they could be for NOFX. And fortunately they did, because it wouldn't be long after that until the band were due for some more new releases. The first of which would be a follow-up live album to I Heard They Suck Live, which the band recorded over the course of 3 shows at the now closed Slim's in San Francisco, California. The second live record was given the title They've Actually Gotten Worse Live and included 24 tracks, one of which was a medley of Stickin' in My Eye and The Decline, and the album made its debut on November 20th of 2007 through Fat Wreck. But a single live record simply wouldn't be enough to keep NOFX or their fans satisfied for an entire year. And having toured the US, Canada, and Europe relentlessly for over 2 decades now, the band were starting to find that their once terrifyingly chaotic tours had now become a little bit uniform and predictable. So to keep things interesting, NOFX decided to book themselves some shows in not just countries they didn't go to very often, but places that most American musicians never even make it to. Putting together a lengthy tour with stops everywhere from Russia to Israel to Singapore to Peru, just to name a handful. And if playing shows in these countries alone wasn't enough, the band also took it upon themselves to film the entire adventure, and they released the footage as a reality TV series they called Backstage Passport that first aired on Fuse TV in April of 2008. And although things were a little bit dangerous at times, NOFX were of course no strangers to taking risks, and especially so at this point in their career, and they found they had so much fun the first time that they did it all again several years later. And the footage from the second run of shows would be released as a feature-length movie in August of 2015. The second one was initially planned to make up for some of the shows that fell through on the first tour, but the band decided to still keep things creative, and this one is honestly an entire adventure of its own. If you haven't seen any of the Backstage Passport stuff, I would highly recommend checking it out. And it's all available on YouTube, so I'll leave a link to a playlist in the description below. But international traveling and touring aside, the bottom line is that the late 2000s were damn good to NOFX. And come the fall of 2008, the band would continue to ride their momentum into the studio, and they returned home to California with the intention of recording what would be their first full-length record in 3 years. The band returned to Motor Studios in San Francisco during November of 2008, where they brought in their old friend Bill Stevenson to handle the production duties. And Bill would help them lay down 12 brand new tracks throughout the process before the record saw its official release on April 28th of 2009 through Fat Records. This album would be given the name Coaster in reference to a similar shape and size of a CD to a table coaster, and it was issued with a mock advertisement on its artwork showcasing such a gimmick. The vinyl release of this record would then fittingly be called Frisbee instead of Coaster, and its artwork would more or less replicate the same gag. And if the new full-length wasn't enough already, NOFX would also issue an EP of additional tracks recorded during the sessions for Coaster later on in November of 2009, and this would debut the now fan-favorite track Cokie the Clown, with which the EP shared the same title. The band would also shoot what would become one of the more famous music videos in their catalog for the EP's said title track, in which Fat Mike runs around dressed like a clown, blowing fake cocaine onto the faces of various punk musicians. And for as much as I love the Coaster record, like I said, this EP and especially this track took off a lot more, and I think the video probably had something to do with that. It's a great example of how NOFX never lost their sense of humor and have remained a pretty relatable lot despite becoming and having been one of the most successful punk bands in the world for over 15 years at this point. And I gotta say, I think that's a big part of the reason their fans have stuck with them so passionately for all these years. Plus, being in the position they were in the 2000s where they could have pretty much done whatever they wanted, they very easily could have just let things settle down and taken it a little bit easier on themselves. But instead, they not only kept up a steady release catalog, but also chose to continue to challenge themselves with their new material. And because of that, they were able to keep giving their audience genuinely great music instead of just another new record. Not only that, but they also took full advantage of the now blossoming digital era and cranked up their antics in their videos even more. And that doesn't even account for the Backstage Passport stuff, which was just as much a smash hit. Instead of slowing down, NOFX chose to give back, and I think that's at least a part of the reason they left such a big impact on punk. As we entered the 2010s, NOFX would of course keep up their avid tour schedule and kept their fans intrigued with a number of 7 inches, B-side comps, and split releases. But their next full-length release wouldn't arrive until the year 2012, when the band hit the studio again, this time at the Blasting Room in Fort Collins, Colorado. And there, NOFX would spend the month of April tracking 12 brand new songs with Bill Stevenson, and the new record made its debut on September 11th of 2012 through Fat Wreck under the name Self-Entitled. And much like Coaster and Cokie the Clown, I think this album also says a lot about NOFX. Not only was it released nearly 30 years into their career, but it too did remarkably well, possibly even better than Coaster and Cokie, and to be honest, I'd say even at this point we still had NOFX in their prime. A lot of the Self-Entitled songs have retained a staple presence in NOFX sets for over 11 years now, and while you could chalk this up to Mike having developed a writing formula that works for the band, I really don't think that's the extent of it. While of course none of these records are punk and Drublic too, the last 3 releases at this point are still clearly evident of a driven, inspired songwriter. And I genuinely believe if Mike had just written us a bunch of good enough songs, fans would have been able to pick up on that. And neither this release or the 2 staple ones before it would have done nearly as well as they did. But anyways, after Self-Entitled dropped, the band would of course keep chugging along with their busy tour schedule further on into the 2010s, making their rounds through the States, Europe, Canada, South America, and Japan, as well as that second run of Backstage Passport shows that I mentioned earlier. But I'd say the next big piece in NOFX history would be the beginning of their now internationally successful punk and Drublic tours that first begun in 2017, and in a lot of ways imitated the early punk years of Warped Tour on a smaller scale, bringing out numerous punk rock household names as support. The band would also dropped several new releases over the course of the past decade, beginning with the full-length First Ditch Effort, which they recorded with the highly renowned producer Cameron Webb and released on October 7th of 2016. And the tour they did in support of that record was largely the last regular NOFX tour before they started doing the Punk and Drublic Fest. But although their touring methods were now a little bit different, that did not mean NOFX was slowing down, and the band would issue a series of B-side releases as well as a live performance of 1991's Ribbed, which they recorded at the Mayan Theater in Los Angeles and released as part of Fat Wreck's Live in a Dive series. The band would then follow up these releases with two full-lengths by the name of Single and Double Album that issued in 2021 and 2022 respectively, but sadly as it stands right now, these appear to be the last full-length albums we're ever going to get from NOFX. And although I wouldn't say either of these releases or a First Ditch Effort are bad by any means, they all definitely showcase a band in the later years of their career toying around with some more experimental tracks that might not be every one of their fans' favorite thing. But even so, I'd say these albums still have their fair share of quality, classic NOFX type of tunes that still satisfy that itch. And although the newer full-lengths have been met with some harsher criticism at times, something you have to remember is that they're being compared to a huge back catalog of downright game-changing releases. Not to mention, with NOFX now reaching the 40-year mark in their career, we also have to remember that no band can stay in their prime forever, and for as incredibly long as theirs may have lasted, that rule still applies here too. Still, I'd definitely be one to argue that they never truly ran out of steam or fell off like others in their position may have over the years. As some of you might remember, back in 2022 though, NOFX announced that they would be retiring after a final run of Punk and Drublic shows throughout 2023 and 2024. But although we seem to be at the end of their history in both their career and the context of this video, it certainly doesn't mark the end of the band's legacy. And now I think it's important to shift our attention to that massive mark on music that they've left behind. So even to say NOFX is one of the most influential punk bands ever would still be a crippling understatement. For one, like I said in the last video, they practically invented the sound of what we think of as 90s skate punk now, and not only that, but really are the definitive band of that era. While maybe not as big as Green Day, Rancid, Bad Religion, or some of their other peers, NOFX are I guess what you could consider the top dogs of cult classics. Instead of having a few hit singles that are remembered by most people in a certain age range while the rest of their material is only celebrated by the underground, NOFX have entire records that are worshipped by practically everyone in said underground. Even if you're talking to a more casual NOFX fan, chances are they don't just know a couple of songs, but they've probably heard a couple whole albums worth of material a good number of times over. Perhaps you could say Linoleum or Stickin' in My Eye might be NOFX's Basket Case or Time Bomb, but if somebody really knows that song, chances are they know at least 2 or 3 others from that respective record just as well. And I honestly think that's a pretty unique phenomenon for a band as big as they are to still have that kind of dedication from the vast majority of their fan base. NOFX also invented a formula that didn't just work wonders for them alone, but it can and has worked for others time and time again. And while maybe not to the same extent that it did for NOFX when they did it first, it certainly benefited a great deal of the bands making up Fat Wreck's roster for the past 3 decades. And being in the position they've been in for so long now, like I said earlier, NOFX have taken every opportunity to give back to the community they came from, putting on countless new bands through Fat, relentlessly touring through quite anywhere in the world they had fans, and also finding ways to let their fan base into their lives in ways that even most underground bands wouldn't think to do. Everyone in NOFX is a big personality in punk now, and in some ways I think a lot of fans feel like we've gotten to know at least their public personas as we followed them throughout their career. And to a lesser extent, the same could be said about their road crew, who've become pretty famous in their own right through a lot of the same endeavors. And I guess you might consider people like Kent Jameson, Limo, and Jay Walker to be the supporting cast to the band members' leading roles. And for as strange as it may seem for a punk band to have a cast of personalities like this, to be honest, I think the theatrical side of NOFX is actually a big part of what got them to where they are now. And for as unnoticed as it sometimes goes, I think it's also something we've seen a lot of bands replicate to a smaller extent. But let's talk strictly about music for a second, because even if it's not as apparent in some people's minds, I think just like all the other widely regarded legendary punk bands like Black Flag or the Misfits, NOFX have left a mark on most punk rockers in some way or another. Even if it's not the most obvious thing in the music someone's band plays or just who they listen to on a regular basis. Something I don't think a lot of outside outsiders understand is that for almost all of us, it's a pipeline through which we discover the music. And after you've heard Green Day, Blink-182, and the Ramones, the next layer of bands, if you will, is typically Bad Religion, Black Flag, the Dead Kennedys, and for a lot of people, including myself, NOFX. And as one of the bands that's been getting hundreds of new people into what we might think of as real punk for decades now, I think that kind of goes to show why NOFX are not only one of the biggest bands in the scene, but also one of the most impactful. And I'd also say it really speaks to the quality of their music. And in regard to that musical formula, I think that's something that can be heard and felt just as much through countless bands of the past 30 years now. Down to the vocal harmony structures and guitar tones, everything that NOFX developed for their own sound has been intentionally replicated and brought success to more bands than I could possibly name in a single segment of a YouTube video. So whether or not NOFX is still playing shows, a permanently documented legacy like this isn't going anywhere. And just like it has for other artists throughout music history, an impact like this doesn't only outlive their careers, but will live on longer than even the musicians themselves. So tours or not, the bottom line is the mark NOFX left on punk rock is here to stay. And finally, as I always do, I'll be leaving you all with some of my personal thoughts on NOFX and the long-lasting impact they've forever left on me for over 10 years at this point. I first got into NOFX when I was 13 years old and discovering punk rock for the first time. And I gotta say, out of all of those gateway bands, they're probably the one that stuck with me the most. Not just in my songwriting and the types of bands I've played with, but they've also left a permanent mark on my left arm in the form of a tattoo. But that first time I heard punk and Drublic, or even the first time I heard Linoleum, I was completely hooked. The guitar tones, the vocal harmonies, the blisteringly fast drums. It completely reinvented how I looked at music instantly. And ever since then, I've taken it upon myself to channel their influence in pretty much all of the bands I've ever been a part of. For as much as I like to say Suicidal Tendencies, Strung Out, and Swingin' Utters are my top 3 bands, I gotta be honest, it's really Fat Mike I have to thank for a lot of what I have as a songwriter. I'm also a pretty stereotypical example of what most punk rockers probably think of as a diehard NOFX fan, if I'm being completely honest, and I've of course gone out of my way to check out all their B-side stuff and extended media. In case those of you who've read it can't already tell, a big chunk of the info in these 2 videos I got from their book, The Hepatitis Bathtub and Other Stories, and I gotta be real, that's one of my favorite things I've ever read. Plus, like I'm sure a lot of you guys watching probably also do, whenever they announce a show in my area, I immediately jump on the tickets to make sure I don't miss it. And one time I even hopped the border up to Canada to see them play in British Columbia. But another thing that's always really resonated with me about NOFX is that they've always had a much more positive approach to a genre that tends to paint itself in a dark, angry corner. And as corny as this might sound, having fun with their albums is something that's gotten me through some of the darkest times in my life. Plus, they've always been upfront about how they were just a group of regular punk guys who happened to get really lucky with their band, and that sense of self-awareness and lack of ego is something I've always really admired and has honestly really shaped how I've lived my life ever since I first discovered their music. Not to mention, for as much as they like to parade themselves as a goofy party band, NOFX have always been very wise when it came to long-term decisions and never compromised their values or took any risks they knew they wouldn't be able to recover from. And because they chose to think before they acted, they've never alienated their fan base or released anything really obviously try-hard or pandering. And even though it may have taken them a little longer to get to where they are now because of it, like the saying goes, slow and steady wins the race, and I think NOFX have won the race at least 1,000 times over at this point. And to be honest, I think a lot of these things are a big part of the reason I ever felt like I had a chance at succeeding with anything in music. So I guess you could say there would be no punk historian if it wasn't for NOFX. They've never had a super flashy image, internal industry connections, or any kind of major label support. They're just a group of genuinely dedicated musicians with a great band who've always put their fans first and made thoughtful decisions. And because of that, it worked out for them in the best way possible. And if that isn't inspiration to stick with what matters to you and do the best you can, I don't know what is. Well, I think that sums up the second entry in our history lesson here on NOFX. Just like last time, I have had so much fun writing and researching for this one, and I can't explain how thrilled I am to finally have this story up here on my channel now. But that's enough for me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What's your favorite NOFX release of the past 24 years? Are you a younger fan of theirs like I am who got into them during this era? And if so, what was it about NOFX that pulled you in? And what made you decide to stick with it and dive into their back catalog? Or if you're an older NOFX fan, what is it about them that made you want to keep listening listening for all these years? And why do you think they've managed to retain such a dominant presence in punk for so long? Let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.
Bag of shit, you suck, I can't believe we'll lock you out.